On a quiet trail outside a small Indiana town, a 14-year-old girl pulled out her phone. She wasn't taking a selfie. She wasn't texting a friend. She was recording evidence. Somewhere on that recording, a man's voice says 4 words. Just 4 words. And for over 5 years, those 4 words were almost the only thing anyone knew about the man who killed her. No name, no face, just a voice, a blurry photo, and a small town of nearly 3,000 people, all wondering the same thing. Is he one of us?
Delphi, Indiana isn't the kind of place you'd expect to make national news. It's a small town, about 60 miles northwest of Indianapolis. The kind of place where everyone knows everyone, and the biggest local landmark is an old abandoned railroad bridge. That bridge is called the Monon High Bridge. Decades ago, trains rattled across it. By 2017, it was just a scenic trail, a place locals walked their dogs, took photos, and let their kids explore on a day off from school. February 13th, 2017 was one of those days off. 2 8th graders, best friends, had the day free. Their names were Abigail Williams, Abby, 13 years old, and Liberty German, Libby, 14. Libby's older sister dropped them off near the trailhead that afternoon so they could hike. It was routine, the kind of thing they'd probably done before. Just after 2 in the afternoon, Libby took a photo of Abby walking across the old bridge. It's a small, ordinary image. 2 friends enjoying the outdoors. It's also the last confirmed photo of them together before whatever happened next. At some point that afternoon, Libby noticed a man approaching them on the trail. And here's the detail that still gives investigators chills nearly a decade later. She had the presence of mind to start recording him. Not call for help, not run. She pulled out her phone and started capturing video of a man in jeans and a jacket, hands in his pockets, walking toward them. On that recording, a male voice can be heard telling them something to the effect of, "Down the hill." That's it. That's almost the entirety of what the world would know about her killer for the next 5.5 years. The girls were supposed to meet a relative around 3:15 that afternoon. They never showed up. By evening, their families knew something was wrong. They didn't wait for a slow response. They started searching themselves, alongside volunteers, before law enforcement's full search effort escalated. The next day, February 14th, Valentine's Day, searchers found their bodies in a wooded area near a creek, roughly half a mile from the bridge. Their deaths were ruled homicides. We're not going to walk you through crime scene detail here. What matters for this story isn't the violence. It's what came after. Because what came after would become one of the strangest, most frustrating investigations in modern American true crime. Within days, investigators had 2 things the public latched onto instantly: a grainy photograph of a man on the bridge and an audio clip of his voice. They released both, and they went everywhere. Local news, national news. The FBI put the image on wanted posters across the country. A man in jeans, a dark jacket, hands in his pockets, head down, walking toward 2 teenage girls. For years, that image was the case. People stared at it. Theories exploded across the internet. True crime forums picked apart every pixel. Was it a hunting jacket? A specific brand of jeans? Could an artist do more with the photo? Could audio experts isolate the voice? Investigators pursued their own leads too, some public, some not. One of the strangest threads, a fake social media profile using stolen photos of a male model that had been used to contact Libby and other young girls online in the months before the murder. Investigators called it Anthony shots.
It turned out to be the work of a man named Keegan Kline. But here's the thing you need to understand clearly. Kline was never charged in the murders.
He was later convicted on separate charges of child exploitation, unrelated criminal conduct that came out of the same investigation. But the murder case itself didn't end there. In 2019, Indiana State Police Superintendent Doug Carter stood in front of cameras and said something that chilled the town even further. He believed the killer likely had ties to the local community. Think about what that does to a place like Delphi. Everyone knows everyone. And now the state's top investigator is telling you the man in that photo might be your neighbor, your coworker, the guy at the pharmacy counter.
Years passed. Composite sketches were updated. Persons of interest were named, then quietly cleared. Nothing stuck. And buried in a filing cabinet somewhere, unnoticed, was a piece of paper that would turn out to matter more than almost anything else in the case. Here's something that didn't come out until years later, in a courtroom, under oath. Just days after the murders, in February 2017, a man living near Delphi voluntarily walked up to a state investigator and said, "I was on that bridge the day those girls disappeared."
He wasn't identified by a witness. He wasn't caught on some hidden camera. He volunteered the information himself, meeting an officer in a drugstore parking lot rather than at his home or the police station. He said he'd seen 3 girls on the trail that day, but hadn't paid much attention. He told the officer he'd been looking at his phone, checking a stock ticker. That man's name went into the system. And then it got buried. A records volunteer had logged the tip, but under an incorrect name. Because he lived on a street called Whiteman Drive, the tip was filed under Richard Allen Whiteman instead of his real name. For roughly 5 years, that tip just sat there, unreviewed, uncross-referenced. A man had told police on his own initiative that he was at the exact scene of the crime at the exact time, and the system lost him in a filing error. That man's real name was Richard Allen. Before we get to how that name finally resurfaced, if you're finding this case as unsettling as we did putting it together, take a second to hit like and subscribe. It genuinely helps this channel keep covering cases like this carefully and respectfully. Now, back to Delphi. Fast forward to 2022, 5 years after the murders. The case had gone cold in the public eye, but investigators hadn't stopped working it. Somewhere in that renewed effort, forensic examiners went back to a piece of physical evidence recovered near the girls' bodies back in 2017. A single unspent .40 caliber bullet. Not fired, not a shell casing from a gun that had gone off, just a round that had, for some reason, ended up at the scene. Advances in firearm and tool mark analysis let examiners do something in 2022 that hadn't been possible or hadn't been done before. Match the microscopic markings on that bullet to a specific weapon. That weapon was a Sig Sauer P226, a .40 caliber handgun. And that handgun belonged to Richard Allen. The same Richard Allen whose 2017 tip had been sitting, mislabeled, in a folder for half a decade. Investigators went back to him. On October 13th, 2022, they re-interviewed him. He again said he'd been on the trail that day, again said he saw 3 girls, again denied any interaction beyond that. But now, they had his gun. And they had a bullet that matched it, found at the exact place where 2 girls had been murdered. 2 weeks later, on October 26th, 2022, Richard Allen was taken into custody. When the arrest became public 2 days later, it hit like a shockwave, not just in Delphi, but across the country. People who had spent 5 years staring at a blurry photograph finally had a name. He was 50 years old, a pharmacy technician at the local CVS. Reports would later note he'd printed photos for Libby's own family,
free of charge at some point before the murders. A detail that, once it came out, made the case feel even closer to home for a community that had spent years wondering if the killer was someone they'd smiled at in line.
He pleaded not guilty. Bond was set at $20 million. He was held without release. The case that had haunted a small town for half a decade finally had a face attached to the name. But having a suspect wasn't the same as having a conviction. That fight was just beginning, and it would take 2 more years to reach a courtroom.
Getting Richard Allen in front of a jury took nearly 2 full years after his arrest. Part of that delay came from the sheer volume of evidence, described in court as extraordinary and voluminous, that had to be shared with the defense. Part of it came from pretrial fights that would foreshadow exactly how contentious this case was going to be. The defense, for one, argued something almost nobody expected, that the girls hadn't been killed by Allen at all, but by a group tied to Odinism, a Norse pagan religious movement that in some forms has been linked to white nationalist ideology. Their argument leaned on the way sticks and branches had been found arranged on and around the girls' bodies, along with a mark on a nearby tree that the defense argued resembled an ancient rune. Prosecutors called it, in blunt terms, a fanciful theory designed for headlines rather than evidence. The judge repeatedly ruled that the defense could not present it in full to the jury. Because the case had saturated local news for years, finding an impartial jury in Carroll County was basically impossible. So the court did something unusual. Jurors were selected from an entirely different county, Allen County, then bussed in to hear the case at the actual Carroll County courthouse in Delphi, the same building at the center of the community the crime had terrorized. The trial began in mid-October 2024. Over the following weeks, prosecutors built their case around 3 pillars. Allen's own admission that he'd been at the scene, the bullet to firearm match, and, perhaps most dramatic of all, statements Allen made while in custody before trial, which prosecutors described as him confessing multiple times. The defense pushed back hard on all 3. They argued the search of Allen's home had been built on a flawed warrant. They argued his in-custody statements weren't confessions at all, but the product of psychological pressure. Allen had reportedly spent significant time in solitary confinement, in a small cell under constant video surveillance, conditions his attorney said were coercive enough to produce unreliable statements. And they argued the state's own experts had holes in their story. One crime scene investigator described the arrangement of sticks as an apparent effort at concealment, while conceding the bodies weren't fully covered. The state's blood spatter expert testified he believed one victim's body had been moved after death, yet couldn't explain the absence of blood on the other victim's hands. There was even a strange, almost human moment buried in the trial's transcript. During a break in his own testimony, Allen appears to have done a quick Google search related to something he'd need to explain on the stand, something he later admitted to under questioning. After 17 days of testimony, the case went to the jury. 5 men, 7 women. They deliberated for roughly 18 hours, spread across 4 tense days. On November 11th, 2024, more than 7.5 years after Abby and Libby disappeared on that trail, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty. On all 4 counts. Reporters in the room said Allen showed almost no visible reaction as the verdict was read. At one point, he turned to look at his wife, who was sobbing behind him. On December 20th, 2024, he was sentenced to 130 years in prison. Allen's attorneys filed an appeal within weeks of his sentencing, and that appeal is still working its way through the Indiana Court of Appeals as we're telling you this story. The state has filed its own briefs, arguing the conviction should stand, and as of the most recent reporting available, no ruling has come down. But underneath all of that are 2 13- and 14-year-old girls who did something ordinary on an ordinary day off from school. They went for a walk with their best friend. They took a photo on an old bridge. They planned to be picked up at 3:15. Libby German, in the last frightening minutes of her life, thought clearly enough to try to document the danger in front of her. That instinct, that small act of courage from a 14-year-old girl, became the single piece of evidence an entire country held on to for years, waiting for it to mean something.
Abby Williams was 13. She doesn't get remembered in most retellings of this case the way her friend does, because it was Libby's phone that captured the recording. But she was there too. She was loved too. And whatever theories, filings, and appeals still play out in an Indiana courtroom, none of that changes what was actually lost on that trail in February of 2017. 2 kids, and everything they would have gone on to become. But mostly, we just hope you'll remember their names. Not the man convicted, not the theories. Abby Williams, Libby German. That's the story worth carrying with you.